Good morning. Welcome to the Clean Grid Alliance Building Partnerships Builds Power Regional Conference. Thank you for being here. I am Beth Soholt, Executive Director of CGA. As many of you know, our mission is to advance renewable energy in the Midwest. To achieve this mission, we've been doing things like state policy, regulatory proceedings, transmission planning, all the non-sexy yet necessary things that need to happen to ensure that renewables can access the energy market. We have been doing this work for 20 years, and this is our first conference. We are so pleased to have convened a great lineup of subject matter experts, 28 of them I counted last night, from a variety of stakeholder groups to talk about our combined vision of delivering a renewable energy future, with a special focus on partnerships. And speaking of partnerships, I would like to thank our many sponsors who have partnered with us to make this event possible. First, we are grateful to our 20th anniversary conference sponsor, EDF Renewable Energy, opening plenary sponsor ITC, afternoon plenary sponsor ATC, our happy hour sponsor Apex Clean Energy, as well as Avangrid, Grid North, Stoll Reeves, Invenergy, Leeward, NextEra, Frederickson and Byron, EDPR, Westwood, National Grid, and many others. It's wonderful to have your support. I'd also like to thank all our member companies and colleague organizations who are with us today, either in person or virtually. And if you're new to Clean Grid Alliance, thank you for tuning in too. We're glad you're here. Now, you might be asking how we came up with the Building Partnerships Builds Power theme for this conference. Well, we have all heard the expression, it takes a village, right? We think that applies to developing a renewable energy project and transitioning to a clean energy economy too. Clean Grid Alliance is a get-her-done organization. Our vision is to deliver a renewable energy future with Midwest renewable energy. One way to move the needle is to develop partnerships. So today, we will be exploring ways that partnerships can help us achieve greater carbon reduction and develop more renewable energy by bringing people together and encouraging collaboration around the common goals that environmental NGOs and industry share. Throughout the day, our speakers and panelists will discuss local, state, and federal issues and the partnerships needed at all levels to implement the clean energy goals set at the federal and state levels by utilities and even corporations and consumers who are all clamoring for more renewable energy. In fact, according to a recent national survey, 93% of American voters say clean energy is important to the country's energy future. That's pretty incredible. Now, before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. First, you can see the schedule for today by scrolling down on the home page. From there, you will see a button to join the breakout sessions of your choice. You are also invited to type in any questions you might have into the chat box that appears on the page. Our chat monitors will ensure the moderator receives your questions, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. For those of you in our live studio audience, you may jot down your questions on the index card you were given when you arrived. One of our staff members will collect them so we can address your questions as well. Don't forget to use the hashtag #BuildingPartnerships to get a conversation going on social media. And if you have technical problems, please use the chat icon to speak with one of our technicians. So let's get started. I'd like to begin by thanking ITC for sponsoring our opening plenary with keynote speaker, FERC Commissioner Allison Clements. Commissioner Clements cares deeply about a timely transition to an equitable, clean energy future that is in the public interest. We at CGA believe her think and do leadership at FERC will be integral to making it happen. Remember, you can put your questions in the chat at any time. So now let's welcome Commissioner Clements. Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you
Hi, Beth. Good morning.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We've got a live and virtual audience today, and I know we are all eagerly awaiting to hear your remarks. So I'd like to turn things over to you, and then we'll have a conversation before taking questions from the audience. So take it away.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to see you. We haven't seen each other in person since pre-COVID.
Right.
Congratulations to you and to Clean Grid Alliance on 20 years. That's really exciting. And I think I've known Beth for about half of that time, at least. And I recalled a story. I was going to one of my first events as an advocate with Clean Grid, differently named, but the previous predecessor to Clean Grid Alliance, and sitting next to Dave Olson, who many of you know, and who was on the CAISO board of directors, among many other prestigious positions in his career. And he was just trying to show me the ropes, and he said, and then there's Beth Soholt, and the world just needs more Beth Soholts. And I think that it was really true. I think she and your organization provided a model for how to do the stuff that you characterize as the unsexy work that has to get done. It's the implementation part. It's the part when the state passes a law, or the utility makes a commitment, or even the federal government takes action. That's not the finish line. That's the starting line for so much of the work that has to get done to equitably and affordably, reliably facilitate the energy transition. And Clean Grid Alliance has provided a model for other groups, regional groups around the country, to do this work for some time. So thank you for having me, first of all, and congratulations to you. There's so much going on around the U.S., certainly in Washington. We don't know what's going to happen over on Capitol Hill. COP is finishing up, and there are a lot of moving pieces that influence the policy decisions and the actions that the commission that I'm on, as well as the state commissions around the country, are going to have to take as part of that implementation work. But regardless of how these things play out, regardless of what happens across town on the Hill, FERC has broad authority and a lot of responsibility relative to our Federal Power Act and Natural Gas Act-driven obligations, which are to protect customers, to avoid discrimination, and to ensure reliability, whatever the changes are in the world around us. The transition is well underway. If we don't pass legislation today, we'll be disappointed, perhaps, or if Congress doesn't pass legislation, but the markets are going where they're going, and it's the Commission's job to try and be helpful in that process. So I've been here for about a year now, or close to a year, when we've been really hit the ground running since Chairman Glick was appointed at the end of January. I've been proud to help lead the establishment of the Office of Public Participation, which I hope very much will lead to increasing the spectrum of voices we're able to hear on any given proceeding at the Commission. We've started proceedings on many important issues, including something I know you'll want to talk about today, and that's transmission, as well as modernizing and updating our gas pipeline certification policy. We've started thinking about regional resource adequacy issues. We were talking about reliability, cyber and physical, in the face of increasing extreme weather and unprecedented threats, and among other efforts. And so I'm really excited to be part of the Commission considering these issues. We have a really dedicated and very busy staff across the agency and in my office focused on making progress. So my starting approach, as many of you know, and I've worked with and are friends with many of you, it won't be surprising to you, but the things that are underlying my priorities and my approach right now are three things: climate change, a changing mix, and cost. And they're all related, but they each have evolved on their own track. Of course, we understand the significance and the ongoing frequency of extreme weather. The Washington Post reported that almost 1 in 3 Americans experience extreme weather this summer. And that's the new normal we're in. This system isn't planned, you all know this, to deal with these new weather realities. The second, of course, is the changing resource mix. And it's increasingly market driven. It's increasingly just plain old economics. But of course, there are also state policies. There are corporate commitments, utility commitments, and just people's expectations driving this change forward. This is not the frame in which the commission operates, but it's a unique case, or perhaps one of few cases where adaptation of transmission investment to deal with the resilience needs of a system facing new stresses from weather also can, if done well and planned, facilitate mitigation through the incorporation of low-cost resources that can then help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the third thing is cost. As we go through this transition, certainly from the perspective of a commissioner at FERC, one of soon to be 5, currently 4, of an independent regulatory commission, we have to get the cost right. We're economic, independent, technology neutral regulators. Now, the facts are on the side of the energy transition relative to cost, but we have to be really careful that as we think about in the planning timeframe what needs to get done in the next 5-10 years, that cost remains front and center, and that we appreciate the magnitude of the required investment. So I'm going to talk mostly about transmission in my planned remarks today before we open it up to questions from you all. I'm speaking to the choir when I say that the challenges we're facing that I just talked about on the climate, on the changing mix, and the cost front require grid system investment to protect customers and to invest in a place that has been underinvested in for several decades, at least parts of our bulk electric system. Relative to the extreme weather we face, you all have probably also told the story that the Winter Storm Uri lessons learned involved the ability to transfer power across regions, and then that how critical that is and will continue to be as extreme weather increases across the country and in areas where that type of interconnection doesn't exist. And then certainly from a smart integration of low-cost clean resources. Everyone is telling us this, the need is understood. MIT is telling us this, Princeton's telling us this, NREL is telling us this. You all in various parts of your work have told us this in analysis, studies, and predictions. So the question is, okay, how do we get it done? And the commission came together happily for me and for all of us, I think, and put out a unanimous advance notice of proposed rulemaking. That is the step prior to any notice of proposed rulemaking that you may engage on to become new regulations from the commission. You saw the broad set of questions we asked to create a broad and deep record of the issues facing the system, our electricity system today. And we got as far as Order 890 and Order 1000, and here we are a decade later. It's a once in a generation opportunity, moment, and need. We don't need to each year revisit the way that we do transmission system planning, but certainly the lessons we've learned coming out of Order 1000 and the time since, those lessons are well understood. And so now what is the right set of solutions? I think importantly, we need to go in with the idea that good work has been done. Well, there's certainly disappointment around the results from the Order 1000 process, and I was a stakeholder in those processes, and I share that perspective. We don't want to screw up the good things that are happening, and there are a lot of examples, including in MISO, of the region working with the states. There are challenges, but to continue to move the ball forward, I think we've seen examples around the country. States are coming together to talk about grid integration in the West and what that will look like for them. We want to make sure that we do no harm as a starting point, but appreciate that new needs, drive new solutions. And so there will be places where those things rub up against each other. They don't have, but we want to start conceptually from a place where we appreciate the good work that is getting done. So I'll just talk shortly about a few of the areas in the docket, or the themes that I'm starting to read as I get through sets of comments. And certainly thank you to all of you who took the time to weigh in. The inputs are being taken very seriously. We are scouring the docket for good ideas and for concerns and emerging themes. The first one, to me, most important, and we kind of said it very clearly, is future-focused planning. We need minimum standards. Yes, we need to provide flexibility, and as I said, not get in the way of progress being made. but we have to anticipate changing needs. The driver of transmission development and the need for new investment, those drivers are not static. They have changed certainly in the last 20 to 40 years. They've changed in the last 10 years pretty significantly, or at least materially. We need to capture those changes and think forward. And I think before we get to the resource mix or take a view on which resources you think should come onto the system and which ones shouldn't, it's just smart planning. I mean, if you plan your budget in your own home and you plan, a home renovation or even buying Christmas presents or whatever it is, if you plan ahead, you do it well and you spend your money more wisely and more effectively. That's what we have to do here. We need to get a good set of inputs. The unknowns are no longer totally unknown. We can start to put parameters around future scenarios, what they look like, and then make small c conservative assumptions if we need to around what that means. But we have to start embracing this idea that we need good inputs, realistic inputs about the scenarios we're going to be facing in the next 10, 15, 20 plus years. The second area that is coming through loud and clear is the need for interconnection reform. And the piece that I'm especially focused on is the coordination of that interconnection reform with the planning process. Improved planning can go a long way to address some, not all, of the issues in our logjam of 700 gigawatts of clean energy resources around the country's interconnection queues. I think Enel put forward an interesting proposal here. I want to commend them, not just because they put forward a proposal. On the merits, it's good. There are, I'm sure that there'll be discussion around the parts of it that are useful. Also, just putting down a concrete framework is really helpful. It gives us something to push and pull on related to this particular set of issues. And there are other examples in the docket. We're still finding them where people have taken the time to do that. In any case, thinking about how we stop the interconnection queue from being a de facto and ill-suited planning process to allowing the interconnection needs to be one of the inputs, not the only, but one of the inputs that go into the planning process, I think will be really important. The third area is, for me, is oversight. We talk a lot, I think Clean Grid Alliance also talks a lot, and I always have, about if you're going to spend, dictate the spending of customers' dollars to make significant investments in infrastructure, you first have to do the cheap stuff. So you start with the cheapest resources, energy efficiency, other demand-side resources that can both decrease, prices on the system, but avoid the need for new investment in the system. In some cases, once you've done that, you need to make sure that the existing system is as efficient as possible. And this is a concept you all know well in terms of grid-enhancing technologies and the opportunities there. The Commission does have an outstanding proposed rule on dynamic line ratings. We've also had a technical conference on one idea, one shared savings way to better align utility incentives with the increasing efficiency of the system to get through some of the structural barriers. But we need to make sure we are getting the existing system efficient. And then we get to, okay, at the local, regional, and interregional level, what's left? And how do we make sure that we are spending money prudently? There has to be some sort of check. The check can come in lots of ways. You'll notice in the NOPR that we didn't dictate specific ideas on oversight because there isn't one right answer. There are a lot of options, and I'm really interested in people's perspectives on how that can play out. There's lots more in the record, and I'm happy to talk to more specific things in addition to what I've mentioned in this part of the conversation. And there's a role for all of us. I think the implementation, the paper development of any action coming out of this ANOPR is going to be really important and require your engagement. Please don't just submit written comments. Please show up at the Commission virtually, talk to the commissioners, talk to staff. That's a really important input, and we want to hear your voices loud and clear. And then from there's going to be a compliance process, and that's going to be important. I think it doesn't matter how perfect we get this rule. It doesn't matter how great it is, how much buy-in there is to the cost allocation mechanisms. If we don't have kind of a general buy-in from stakeholders, from the states, The vote against the transmission line coming through Maine on Tuesday night that's real. We have to figure out and learn lessons from what took place there, what issues are specific to voters of Maine's perspective, and what issues that you all have been grappling with throughout the Midwest and beyond are coming up. We need that buy-in. We need to pivot towards constructive solutions. And I think one thing that the commission has done, there's lots of things that lots of people can do there. One is to establish this joint federal state task force that's going to meet for the first time this month and actually next week in Louisville at the NARUC meeting. I've participated in forums where we all get together and talk and then kind of leave thinking, what got done? But I think there is a serious commitment, at least on the commission side. And I know from the members that are representing states across the country that they are taking this really seriously. We have to have some of these hard conversations around states' interests, where flexibility is needed, where the pain points are, relative to siting and other issues that we can just talk about outside of contested proceeding. That's going to be an important part of getting a common sense or a common vision around what needs to get done. We're also having a technical conference at the commission the week after that, and certainly there's steps to come on the rulemaking front. So to me, success is a durable, comprehensive rule. We don't necessarily need to undermine all of the existing processes, but there is a need for change, and a need for change in a way that provides enough clarity that we don't spend another 5 years hemming and hawing over what actually was intended or what got sent. I think I'll pause there on the transmission piece. I just want to mention two other things that I'm thinking about in particular before Beth, I turn it back to you. One is the participation of demand-side resources in markets and on the system planning side. I had mentioned that in the transmission front, but I want to call that out just in general. We have, taken action at the commission, Order 745, Order 841, Order 2222. We haven't cracked the nut as effectively on the system planning side. That still exists. And sorry, I just got a weird. And I think there is more to do on both fronts. This is another place where lower cost resources can provide real benefits in the operational time frame in extreme weather circumstances. Certainly that came through as one of the top 3 recommendations out of the CAISO, or I don't know if it was 3, but one of the top recommendations out of the CAISO root cause analysis about the heat impacts on the system and operations last summer, as well as the preliminary findings from the FERC report that just came out. And we've got to find a way to get at the jurisdictional barriers on the state federal side, as well as the operational barriers and interoperability of the systems. We have to think about, how do we marry the required investments with the potential beneficiaries of these resources? How do we think about energy adequacy and cost savings approaches to that? How do we value resilience and flexibility? All of these things come up in lots of contexts at the commission, but if there's one thing that, in addition to transmission, I want to be focused on during my time as one of the commissioners, that's where it sits. And my final note I'll end on is in the area of diversity. I think that the energy industry, we all know, hasn't been a traditionally diverse place, not just on gender, not just on race, but on from a whole lot of other perspectives. I think COVID is bringing some of those things to light. It's also given me, in some ways, more time to think about some of these issues. And so there's a lot of people committed at the commission to working on diversity inclusion for all types of people, to try and bring people into the fold of our sector to develop expertise where it hasn't been developed before, and to frankly tell the story that this kind of technical, specific, legal, regulatory, economic work we do matters in real life. I think Beth's someone who's really good at doing that, and we can all think about that. And certainly I'm committing to trying to make that part of the conversation as the commission moves forward. And so with that, I'll say thank you again and pass it back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, you've certainly given us a lot to chew on here, and maybe we can unpack a few of these things. Because I know transmission and interconnection issues are the core of what some of our membership cares about, I'm not going to start with that. So let's probe a couple of the other issues you just brought up. So you really talked about demand-side resources, the benefits they can provide to the marketplace and to consumers. I think there's, as you say, there's a lot of work going on to really understand how we do that, how we interconnect resources, what role they're going to play in the wholesale marketplace, the jurisdiction between state regulators and federal regulators. And so I just wanted to provide a real-life example, I think in real time, from work that's going on at MISA right now. They have DER task force, we affectionately call it DERF, work going on right now. And, you know, I know they had a meeting yesterday, and one of the things that they're really struggling with is how do we look at the DER impacts kind of writ large to the transmission system? And so you start to get into these kind of interjurisdictional or multi-jurisdictional issues. So we're quickly going to the heart of the matter on some of these really technical and difficult issues. Have you at the Commission received comments or thought about how do we get a handle around DER impacts to the transmission system, what we need to do on the planning or even the interconnection side? We certainly don't have the answer yet. I think there has to be some kind of a process put in place to do a check. And then just like if there were impacts from any other bulk transmission system interconnected resource, the question always comes up of who pays to mitigate those impacts. So I think it's really a two-step question. How do you get a handle around the impacts? Are there impacts? And then what do you do about the who should pay for the mitigation or the upgrades that need to happen? So I'm going to throw that really easy question over to you.
I'll try and unpack your unpacking. There's a lot in there. On the market side, I think
and Commissioner, I would just recognize that, you know, we're on the very front end of this, trying to figure out really under Order 2222 how DERs participate more fully. And so I think we're all struggling with this together.
Sure. And I'll just caveat that we do have some 2222 compliance filings before us, so I can't get into the specifics of that. I will say generally on the market side, the lanes are clearer. The Supreme Court has been clear, and there are still growing things jurisdictionally. Before we get to the in real life part, but jurisdictionally, there are still a few gray areas in any given circumstance. However, you can go to the series of decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court and by the DC Circuit and say, okay, the Commission has full jurisdiction to open its markets to all resources that can compete. And the state retains jurisdiction over distribution system reliability and over interconnection and over its resource mix. There are still situations where we struggle there, but on that, the path forward is clearer, and we will figure out what happens around whether or not states have the right to opt out, or there will be that debate goes on. There's in the record on the transmission system planning side, you know that it didn't work out in Order 1000, and the on-paper opportunity for competition from resources to avoid transmission investment didn't happen as in any sort of robust way. Now, we could have maybe thought, how could we have been more specific 11, 12 years ago about which types of things, which types of projects deserve to be considered, alternatives need to be considered for, who has the right to consider them. There's a lot of questions around that. And there's record to still consider in this A-NOPR docket on that front. I've been wondering, and this isn't, don't take this as a direction the Commission is headed right now, but how do you give the states the opportunity on the system planning side to put forward alternatives, right? As opposed to relying just within the confines of the regional planning process. Is there an opening for states in some way to come in? I don't know if that's right, but the current approach isn't making a lot of progress, and there's a lot of issues. You raised one of them, who are the beneficiaries and who pays for the mitigation to other resources, and we're seeing those issues on the storage the transmission front as well, right? They're coming out.
Absolutely,
So,
right.
yeah, I don't, you know, we're bound by the beneficiaries pay principle. When you start to cross systems, it gets complicated, and I don't know how much progress we've made there.
Yeah. Do you anticipate that in the FERC, too many acronyms this morning, NARUC, FERC joint planning effort, that this would be a topic?
Absolutely.
Since you have jurisdictional folks from both sides sitting at the table?
Absolutely. I hope it's an important part of the conversation. And I also think there's an opportunity to model this task force. We all have a lot on our plates right now, but if we're able to find ways to make progress that flow from the task force into rulemaking proceedings, there's no reason we shouldn't pull out other areas of conversation, like the issue of split jurisdiction, or not split, but concurrent jurisdiction over demand-side resources, and you know, dig in deeper on that. So that's something that I would be enthusiastic about. You know, it will be important in the transmission planning context as a first step.
Right. Let's turn to diversity and inclusion for a moment. Appreciate that that's, you know, one of your top priorities. It's something that the industry, renewable energy industries, understands they need to do some more work on. And I think that because Clean Grid Alliance has been in policy work in states for, 20 years, we've had a hard time kind of finding concrete solutions for some of these issues as they've come up in legislative context, for instance. And so I think that one thing that we would be focused on is, how do we make this real? How do we find real solutions? How do we, what are the consequences of having some requirements, and how do we make sure those get done? So it is another area that I think we have a lot of work to do. And, the Solar Energy Industries Association has put out a report not too long ago on efforts that SEIA has underway and things that companies are doing. But I think that it's risen to the top for a lot of companies in trying to figure out what more to do. So, so I don't have a solution or an answer. I just know that we're hearing a lot about it and really struggling with what does it mean? And how do we make things concrete? Yeah,
I am as well. And, there's big solutions and there's little steps. And I've decided that while we talk about the big solutions, I'm going to try and take little steps. What universities are in my town, right? Washington has lots. We're fortunate on that front. Who thinks of energy issues as important? What other, schools or programs within schools, whether they be law schools, engineering schools, public policy schools, or economics programs, if we told them why this is important, would start to catch on. Those are very small things to do, to go talk to people, and there's a need to create the space right now. And that's hard. It's hard to train people who have a whole lot to bring to the table, but who haven't lived in our jargon soup and technical system approach for their whole careers. You might learn one area, but then you turn the page to the next part of the law or the regulation or the engineering report, and it's completely different. So it's, I think, recognizing it and saying, yeah, it's hard, and then what little things can we do together? I've been really impressed by the work that SEIA has done on this front. I think that they've helped to move the dialogue to make equity part of the solution, not something that lives around the edges.
Yes. So I love the little steps. A lot of little steps add up to a bigger push. So more to do on that front. I want to turn back to some of the questions I know we have in the audience and thoughts that people are having around some of the themes that you mentioned earlier. The industry and our membership, both NGO and industry sides, are focusing a lot on the ANOPA right now. I know we had a lot of people put in comments. We have people who are going to be sitting on panels at the technical conference, so a lot more dialogue there to be had there. But I think that for me, if I would boil everything down to a nutshell, for me, it comes down to one word, and that is timing. How do we make sure we have a timely transition in all of these areas and that we can timely change our generation because of climate concerns and economic opportunities? How can we get the grid really constructed in a timely manner? You know, how do we make our transmission planning process flow more smoothly so that we don't have all this planning going on and then at the 11th hour we have people, you know, up in arms about what's coming out of the process. So a lot here to unpack too, but I appreciate the fact that you recognize there has been a lot of good things happening. I think that we've worked very hard, and I can only speak to MISO, but in the MISO context to raise the good stuff that's happening in that process, to integrate things more holistically, to improve the futures that MISO is planning on. You know, MISO did a lot of good work getting the futures really more commensurate with what we're seeing in the real world. It's amazing to me how we still get pushed back on future number one that really is around utility IRPs. And, you know, the stakeholders decided, well, of the stuff that's been announced, we're only going to plan for 85% of it because we just don't know if 100 is going to be there. That's probably okay, but so even in that real scenario, we still have people saying, is it really real? And so I think, you know, MISO's looking at their interconnection process right now is 565 days or something like that, and their goal is to bring it down to like 365, just a year. So so the word timely and timing for me is really kind of the crux of some of these things, and then all the other things that you've enumerated around cost and inputs and things like that. But I think right now, what keeps me up at night is that the MISO system is not going to be ready to facilitate the kind of future that people are expecting, that utilities want from a interconnecting new resources perspective, and that corporations are demanding and things like that. So I think we're feeling constantly behind the 8 ball. So how are we going to make that better?
It is timing.
Yeah.
It is the idea that if you think about spending $1 or not spending $1 right now today, then in the very near term, you can argue that a customer loses. If you think about spending now smartly to well-positioned customers relative to the cost of electricity and the real life costs of extreme weather and the ability to withstand it, you know, either warmly or cooling in a cold fashion, we have to start now. And to me, you really nailed it with the idea of the inputs. I think MISO is a good example of the futures process. You have to have good, realistic inputs to get good outputs. And there is, I guess, to me, how do we stop fighting over the inputs? Now, yes, we're talking about orders of magnitude here. And I think up to some percentage of investment, there's a lot of no regrets investment, right? Before we get to the pieces where there might be some fights about, but we have to have good scenario planning where people buy into the inputs, and the MISO process to develop those inputs is one example. I won't make a judgment on the success of it, but I having not participated in it, and because I shouldn't, but it's, you know, that is the critical piece.
Yeah, and Commissioner, if I can just add one more thought here. Because we're in the weeds, you know, we know that the interconnection queue only interconnection agreements that are signed are factored into the planning process because they have certainty around them? Should we be looking at, another tranche of something that gets inputted because the signed GIAs are just one indication? So can we do something around that to represent the queue much more wholly than we are today? So I think, one of the key themes for us is getting that planning for transmission and interconnection more closely aligned. That would be a big success. I want to just flip to a couple other questions that are coming in here. Kelly, can you just scroll up? Yeah, thank you. Let's go to the second question. This is a good one, Commissioner. President Biden recently indicated a desire to have transmission lines buried underground. Thoughts on this?
That would be great in the places where the benefit cost balance play out. It's expensive. I think we have to be creative about all the ways that we can get transmission done. We haven't talked yet today about the siting challenges and what that means for success and the role that federal agencies play, I guess, at least in the western side of MISO perhaps, but west to your west neighbors in terms of getting through the process on the federal end, getting through the process on the state end, thinking about a lot of the good work that some of our your fellow nonprofits, my previous fellow nonprofits have done on this front about the land impacts and the habitat impacts of transmission development. It just all points to finding the places that are disturbed and using them as well as we can. And thinking from, I've said before when I talk with folks at NARUC, we're all struggling to figure out what it means to be a regulator right now in this day and age, what lowest cost investment means, or how you define prudence in light of everything we've just talked about. So there's no precedent for the decisions that regulators across the country and legislators across the country are making. But absolutely, that should be on the table in the places where it makes economic sense, and that's still hard. Yeah.
Turning to a different topic that's coming in here is a question: affected system issues. So when you interconnect and you have a SPP or a PJM affected system, two questions really here. What is FERC thinking about, or to the extent you can comment on, what are you thinking about doing with those affected system issues? And then we have some affected systems across the footprint that are not FERC jurisdictional. And so how do we work to coordinate things with non-FERC jurisdictional entities? That's just a small question.
Not one half of it. One half of that question isn't easier than the other. Yeah. Just this week, my team and I were going through the themes of the interconnection related reforms. And there is the need on the bigger picture, optimizing or not coordinating the interconnection process with the planning process and how those things relate. There's also a lot of maybe not necessarily easier, but more discrete fixes that could be implemented as a series that help get at some of the issues within the existing interconnection process, and that is meeting deadlines on studies and some set of readiness qualifications that you referenced up front relative to how you go into the queue, the way the cluster studies are done. There's a rich record. There's lots of suggestions there, and everybody who cares about these issues, and that's, I guess, the docket, are pointing to the need to make reform on the interconnection front. So again, I don't want to prejudge where we end up, but that's certainly, those issues are on the table. Yeah. And that relates to affected system studies as well.
Got it. So I think, having done queue reform in MISO probably 4 or 5 times within the last 20 years, I think one thing we really struggle with is we have so many different sizes of companies who are doing development. How do you make an interconnection process that works for everyone? And you don't make it just whoever can come up with the biggest pile of cash wins. That's always been a little bit of a dilemma. So, in kind of the looking at the equitable, it's really a balance of having something work for everybody, but making the process better and weeding out the people who are just sitting in the queue for no good reason. I guess they probably have a good reason, but it's finding that balance.
Sure. The process shouldn't only work for one type of interconnecting customer, right?
Right. Can you say a little bit more for the audience who may not know about the suggestion that NL made around the interconnection reform? Can you say just a high level, a few words about that?
Sure. NL put forward, attached to their comments, a white paper that puts forward a proposal that tries to clarify and take steps to make clear the steps in the interconnection process, to better coordinate what's happening in the interconnection process with what's happening on the transmission planning side. And there's 3 or 4 steps. And, the first is from getting clarity around who pays for the upgrades, not surprisingly, and whether, if you use a transmission distribution factor, if I have those letters right, as with some, number as the step, and interconnecting customers who have impacts above that percentage factor are paid for by more customers than just the interconnecting customer. I hope someone's watching who's not going to call me on my explanation. Someone who's interconnecting with less of a factor, they pay for the upgrades. It's pieces in the step, and it's not the only answer. To be clear, it's an idea of. Yes. It gives us it's one straw to put forward to have the conversation around, and certainly, I appreciate the chance to have that.
Yes, thank you for kind of explaining that a little bit more. I mean, I think there's probably, the good news is there's no shortage of ideas. I think what we do need, and we're going to get there with the commission hopefully, is somebody to decide what route we should go to make it better, and then we'll be on to implementation.
Yeah, I think the message from my perspective isn't to bog down in the details of that proposal or the other kind of set of more discrete reforms that have been put forward, but to say we appreciate, certainly there's a whole team of staff that appreciate that those proposals have been put forward, and that there is a recognition of the urgency of the need both to clear up the log jams in the near term for those projects who have been lingering for a significant amount of time, and more long term so the process works from the start.
Before we run out of time, I just want to turn a little bit to federal energy legislation that is inching its way towards the president's desk. Do you have a sense of what might be in there that will impact what FERC needs to do one way or another? Anything that would be that will be helpful? Certainly, having some of the tax incentives and other pieces that we think are going to make it across the finish line will provide probably even more activity and churn in the development community. There's going to be, we are looking at a very robust amount of development, and because the Midwest has good solar and wind resources, and we are working on transmission, I can imagine that, and I've always thought the Midwest is going to have to do more than its share for climate change reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And so, so I guess the question is, what do you envision in federal legislation that will impact FERC work?
I'm going to intentionally punt a bit on that answer relative to the position I sit in, but you mentioned several of the things in the bills being considered that will increase activity and spending on infrastructure, transmission, distribution, and generation supply, certainly. And there's a reality that, we feel the need to get moving relative to some of these implementation issues that are already on the table, because if you can't clear up the interconnection queue that's there, getting more resources in the interconnection queue venture success, necessarily to success. As the other comment I haven't made that I think about and we are working on, but we are an independent regulatory agency, is the role of the rest of the government agencies. If you look at Department of Energy and Secretary Granholm, and you look at the Department of Interior, Secretary Holland, and there's a real focus on these issues in a way that I've been an observer in both cases, but that there haven't in all cases, but there haven't been in previous administrations. And so I think about how the good work coming out of the national labs can inform our scenario planning processes, can make sure that we are having good inputs. When I think about lines that are in the transmission lines that are in the national interest, and the role that one of the labs could help us play in mapping some of those out, in the role that the government is playing in, dialogue around offshore wind system planning. That might be less of an issue from the Midwest perspective, but there are opportunities. And in my mind, this is a chance to figure out how to let those, the good work that's getting done help the processes that are FERC jurisdictional.
So in the remaining minutes, I wanted to turn to talking about the Office of Public Participation for a couple of minutes, because I think that goes directly towards acceptance and factoring in what the public cares about into the planning process, and also thinking about how do you see the Office of Public Participation helping with the siting challenges for transmission and for generation sometimes. I mean, I guess it wouldn't be generation, but it would be siting of transmission where we kind of have a lot of ENGOs at the national and regional and state levels who have goals and want to see progress made, but they're also pushing back in cases where they don't like transmission siting. And so does the Office of Public Participation look at making that better? How do you see kind of what would be all encompassing in the Office of Public Participation?
Thank you for asking. I'll respond in two parts. The first is what is the intended role of OPP in general, and then as it relates to transmission siting. My vision, and I think it matches the statute's intent of what the Office of Public Participation should do, is to bring interested members of the public, landowners, people with farms who are going to have their land disrupted by an infrastructure decision, and that would be on the natural gas side, by communities that are going to see natural gas pipelines come through, but also on the electric side, by customers who worry about electricity costs and who don't understand how to navigate the e-library and e-file and intervene at the commission and then pay attention to a long, protracted, paper-heavy proceeding filled with legal, technical analyses and jargon. It's helping them understand how they can get into those existing proceedings. So their voice is one of the voices or one of the inputs into the record that the commission considers when it makes a decision. That will make our decisions better. It will make us a better commission in terms of satisfying our obligation to serve the public interest. It'll also hopefully make our decisions more legally durable relative to challenges. Now, unfortunately on the transmission, unfortunately on the transmission siting side, the commission does not have active jurisdiction over transmission siting. Right. And as a result, the OPP won't play a direct role without some change in our authority on transmission siting. I think what may happen is it will wake people up to the commission, wake people up. It will help people learn about the commission because they are going through some sort of process in their community related to a transmission siting or a generation siting issue that they have concerns about or want to weigh in on. It will help them understand there is this other commission over there in Washington with broad jurisdiction, and then whether or not that leads to more interaction, we'll see. But for now, it will not. The issues that you mentioned are ones hopefully that the state federal task force will be a starting place for, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Do you anticipate, and maybe because it doesn't have jurisdiction OPP over, or FERC over transmission siting. I'm just trying to think creatively on, I think over the years, our utility companies have done a much better job of getting out into the public areas, out into the areas that are going to be potentially hosting transmission facilities and connecting the dots on why more transmission is needed, what it brings to the community. It's a part of hosting infrastructure and hosting, allowing generation to come into their community where they do probably get landowner payments or tax base, et cetera. And so while I think the utilities have moved the ball forward on notifying and having a dialogue with the general public, perhaps I hear you saying that the OPP will do the same thing kind of on the federal level and just at least educate people about the process and that their input matters.
That's right. That's a great idea. I mean, there are models. We're not inventing this out of whole cloth. There have been decades of models of people trying to provide public access to regulatory processes. And I think there's a lot to learn from efforts within government and by industry relative to that. In terms of the role, there will be an outreach role. And the starting point for the communities that we think about are those that are where there's an application for an interstate gas pipeline certification that affects those communities. That's the kind of the natural starting point, but certainly I hope that we can grow it from there.
Well, Commissioner, thank you so much for our dialogue this morning. We've just scratched the surface. I know there's much more to do, but I'm excited that you are at FERC with your skills and talents. I know that we're really going to be able to advance the ball on these issues with Chair Glick, who comes from the renewable energy industry and understands some of the challenges. So we so look forward to working with you going forward. And thank you very much for spending some time with us this morning.
Thank you, Beth. It's such a pleasure, and it's really nice to see you. I appreciate the time.
Thanks. Hopefully we can see each other in person one of these days.
That would be so nice.
Yes. Thank you very much. So that was a great conversation, and I know we had a few questions that we couldn't get to, but certainly more with Commissioner Clements to come in the future. So before we get into our full day of breakout sessions, I'd like to remind you, if you didn't already know, that this year is our 20th anniversary. Yes, can you believe it? For 20 years, CGA has worked deep in the weeds, as you just heard in our conversation, on the issues that are mostly behind the light switch. That's why our 20th anniversary theme is Power Behind the Power. And so for 20 years, we have worked behind the light switch to drive progress for renewable energy in the Midwest. For 20 years, we've been advocating for policies to drive demand. For 20 years, we've been working to ensure there is a road to the electricity market for renewables. And we believe this work is the foundation upon which a renewable energy future is built. So I'm happy to say we're on our way to a sustainable future using renewable energy. Here in the Midwest, over the course of 20 years, we started with about 700 megawatts of wind in 2000. And we've grown to about 28,000 megawatts and growing today. So that's quite an accomplishment, and all of you have joined us in that. But we also need to build strategic partnerships to help us going forward. And that's why partnerships is our focus today. All the work we do on policy, regulatory reform, cost allocation, and building transmission are vital building blocks to delivering a renewable energy future. But none of it matters if we can't get steel in the ground. We believe building partnerships is one of the most important ways we can be successful. Why? Because building partnerships builds power. We mean that both literally and figuratively. And that's why CGA's membership structure has been a purposeful collaboration of a variety of stakeholders who are united behind a common goal: to reduce carbon and develop a clean energy future. Our members include wind, solar, and energy storage developers, manufacturers, nonprofit environmental, public interest, and clean energy organizations, law firms, and other businesses that support renewable energy. We bring our members together frequently to try to gain consensus on some of the thorny issues, such as some of the ones we'll be tackling today on our panels. We're celebrating our anniversary all year with special blog posts and newsletters, social media highlighting key milestones, and well wishes from friends and colleagues. I hope you'll give us a shout out today on social media using our anniversary hashtag #BehindThePower. For those of you at home, we're going to take a short break now before our federal policy session. So please take a moment to refresh your coffee and come back at 10:10 Central Time.